49 at O'Hare, 52 Lakefront, 50 in rain at Midway. Your next news update is at 7:30. Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan and Amy continues next on AM 560, The Answer.
Listen to AM 560, The Answer, online at 560theanswer.com, on the AM 560 mobile app, on your Alexa-powered smart speaker, on TuneIn, iHeart, and radio.com. This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560, The Answer.
Lethality of coronavirus, as well as the steps that were being taken to contain in some respects and more the case now, mitigate in others. And part of the problem is the decentralized federalist system of governance we have. So some states have declared states of emergency and other states haven't. Some localities are seeing more of an outbreak than other localities. And so it's not just a federal response, but it's also a state and local response.
Yeah, New York declared a state of emergency. They have 89 cases there. And Governor Cuomo was quick to rip on the CDC and the Trump administration.
CDC is a bottleneck for this nation in doing the testing. I believe the CDC was caught flat-footed. I believe they're slow in their response, and I believe they're slowing down the state.
Well, this is something that Scott Gottlieb, the former FDA director in the Trump administration, suggested weeks ago, which is allow for lab-developed tests at the local level, the local healthcare level in this country.
And we have 3 here: Chicago, Springfield, and Carbondale.
Gottlieb was on with Face the Nation over the weekend. And, he painted a little bit more dire of circumstances than did some of the Trump administration officials current.
The next 2 weeks are really going to change the complexion in this country. We'll get through this, but it's going to be a hard period. We're looking at 2 months, probably of difficulty. To give you a basis of comparison, 2 weeks ago, Italy had 9 cases. 95% of all their cases have been diagnosed in the last 10 days. For South Korea, 85% of all their cases have been diagnosed in the last 10 days. We're entering that period right now of rapid acceleration. And the sooner we can implement tough mitigation steps in places where we have outbreaks like Seattle, the lower the scope of the epidemic here.
Well, and that also takes coordinated federal, state, local response rather than people, jawboning to score political points like Cuomo tried to do. Gottlieb explaining, this is a struggle for a country that's a free society in dealing with something when you have power decentralized.
No state and no city wants to be the first to basically shut down their economy, but that's what's going to need to happen. States and cities are going to have to act in the interest of the national interest right now to prevent a broader epidemic.
Shut down their economy. You mean
close businesses, close large gatherings, close theaters, cancel events. I think we need to think about how do we provide assistance to the people of these cities who are going to be hit by hardship, as well as the localities themselves, to try to give them an incentive to do this. Right now, if there's no economic support to do this, you don't want to be the first to go. And I think you're seeing that. This exposes one of the challenges of our federal system, that we leave a lot of authority to state and local officials. And there's good reasons why. But in a situation like this, where you want them to act not just in their local interests, but the national interests, I think we need to think about both trying to coerce them, we can't force them, but also try to provide some incentives in terms of support. And we're going to end up with a very big federal bailout package here for stricken businesses, individuals, cities and states. We're better off doing it up front and giving assistance to get them to do the right things than do it on the back end after we've had a very big epidemic.
Well, that's an easy thing to say. It's a difficult thing to quantify. How big should the bailout package up front be, Scott? I mean, you just had $8.5 billion allocated. How much more is needed, and for what exactly? How do you predict the economic impact of this when you don't even have you can't predict at this point the denominator? See, this is why, everybody trying to score political points are charlatans. Those people are charlatans because they don't know.
Well, it's like the Democrats are cheering for people to die and for the economy and the stock market to tank so that they could stick it to Trump and blame him for this and his administration. And I don't like that at all.
And Gottlieb also talked a little bit about the lethality rate, too, after talking about, the challenges with a systemic response, federal-driven response.
There's no systematic plan for when a city should close schools, when they should tell businesses that they have to telework, when they should close movie theaters and cancel large gatherings. We leave these decisions to local officials, but we really should have a comprehensive plan in terms of recommendations to cities and in some support from the federal government for cities that make that step, make that leap, if you will. And the case fatality rate here is going to be higher all through the age ranges. This is a more severe disease. Now, it's true that you don't see the full spectrum of disease that you see with the flu, where some people get a mild disease, some people get a moderate disease, some people get more severe disease. Here, you're seeing a more binary response. Some people get mild and moderate disease, and some people get very sick. But for the people who get very sick, this could be a very dangerous disease. The case fatality rate is probably going to be about 1%. And it's not just older Americans, as tragic as that is, and we shouldn't dismiss the burden that this is going to place on older Americans. If you look at 40-year-olds, the case fatality rate has been anywhere between 0.2 and 0.4%. So that means as many as 1 in 250 40 to 50-year-olds who get this could die from it.
And this data is based on what? On China?
This data is based on
South Korea?
reporting out of South Korea and China.
Right.
Yeah, but South Korea and China, China, their air quality is horrific. Their healthcare system is abysmal. I mean, you can't even compare that to us.
That's what the follow-up should have been from
Yeah,
Brennan to him about, so this is based on that data coming out of China. But what about largely, because that's where most of the cases are. I mean, there's 100,000 cases globally, just over, allegedly, and more than 80,000 of those come from China, if you even believe those numbers. And this was the point that Surgeon General Dr. Jerome Adams made on Tapper.
Some parts of the country are having much more severe flu seasons. Some are having very mild flu seasons. The same thing for coronavirus. So you want to first try to keep it out of your community. Once you know it's in your community, you want to take the steps to prevent spread within the community and to keep those most at risk safe. And a very important point here, we now know more about who is at risk. Average age of death for people from coronavirus is 80. Average age of people who need medical attention is age 60. We want people who are older, people who have medical conditions, to take steps to protect themselves, including avoiding crowded spaces, including thinking very carefully about whether or not now's the time to get on that cruise ship and whether now's the time to take that long-haul flight.
For more on this, we're pleased to be joined by Lieutenant Colonel Jim Carafano, Vice President of the Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for International Studies at the Heritage Foundation, and author of books including Wiki at War and Private Sector Public Wars. Jim, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, good to be with you.
So how do you assess the coordinated response from the federal government so far, as well as the challenges that Dr. Gottlieb raised about, the decentralized nature of our federal system?
I really take objection to the notion that we should have a much more centralized system. Actually, we did in 1917, and that actually contributed significantly to the spreading of the Spanish flu, because we took one set of directions and it took us in the wrong direction. I actually think that the decentralized response in the U.S. is actually a strength. So I completely disagree with that. Look, we're 320 million people, literally without internal borders. The notion of mass quarantine, I just don't know how that makes any logical sense. And in short, what we've actually seen where people have gone to mass quarantine, what you wind up doing is you isolate healthy and sick people together, and you just ensure that the healthy people get sick. So I thought that was, to be honest, just a lot of baloney from somebody who was supposed to be a public health expert.
Yeah, I mean, I was a bit taken aback by what Gottlieb had to say as well, because I think otherwise he's made a lot of sense on a range of healthcare issues over the years. But he's painting a lot more dire picture than, say, the Surgeon General or Admiral Brett Giroir, who is a four-star admiral and the Assistant Secretary of HHS, who talked about what they estimate to be the lethality rate and a little bit about the containment approach as well. And it seems to me that's where the federal response should be focused.
It does seem, I mean, the more we get real solid numbers about cases that are more analogous to us, societies with more modern healthcare systems, it doesn't seem to be that dramatically different than the regular flu season. And in a sense, I think a lot of these recommendations are responses that would do more harm to society than the disease itself. I think this, people keep saying we should probably talk about something we understand more, which is how does this play out in people's credibility and understandability of government. People say this is Trump's Katrina. The problem with that is before Bush had a Katrina, he had an Iraq War. And people had already come off the Iraq War deeply skeptical about the administration. And so they were primed. And the other thing you had in Katrina was a lot of physical damage and destruction that people could see. I mean, there's an argument whether Bush actually did anything wrong in Katrina at all. But that wasn't the point. Is everybody blamed him with that. We don't have those dynamics here. Trump hasn't had a big failure, so his credibility, it hasn't been questioned before. And in all likelihood, most of this will be highly transitory. The flu season will come to an end. The stock market will rebound. People will buy up a bunch of cheap oil now, and they'll have it later. And by the time that we're into, when people sit down and they start thinking about who do I want to vote for president, which is September, October, I mean, there may be something else that distracts them and angers them, but likely this will be something in the distant past.
James, it's a crazy question, but is somebody playing the stand-up bass behind you by any chance?
Oh, I'm sorry, guys. We're having some construction here at the Heritage Foundation.
Okay.
So occasionally it sounds like I'm in the middle of a dentist's office.
Oh,
and it just stopped.
Like the
Sorry
bass.
about that.
Oh, no, it's okay. All right, so we have two schools closed here in Chicago. One's a private Catholic school. The other one's a public school for special needs students. Do you think that's too much to do at this point in time? I mean, one, the teacher's aide did contract coronavirus, excuse me. And in the other case, it's just somebody who came in contact with somebody who has contracted the coronavirus, a student.
Well, I mean, I think this is why we let local people make their decisions and evaluate the risks and decide what they want to do. In some case, you might have low risk, but you might decide shutting down for a couple of days. Makes perfect sense. My guess is as we proliferate testing, we'll probably find the disease is more widespread than we thought. But the point is that's because a lot of the people that might test positive actually have very mild cases. And the other thing is we're going to wind up doing is we're going to test a whole bunch of people who don't have it. Just because if they've got the flu or just they touched somebody who had, a flu, they're going to want to get tested. So, but that's okay too. I mean, there isn't, sometimes people think there's an exact right things to do, which will make all the problems go away. And a lot of big complicated things, particularly in public health issues, there isn't. The answer is it's going to be a little messy. We're going to get through it fine.
It's interesting, just going back to what you said too about faith in government. So some of the skeptics about the central government and central planners and federal response, generally speaking, in crisis, when they sort of lose their bearings and and then their feet are no longer firmly planted on the ground, they look to the government. And so I like that you raised that, because it's an opportunity to take a step back and wait a second. This is a federal government you don't think is very good, based on all kinds of good reasons, like the evidence, very good at social engineering, very good at knowing just how to calibrate the interactions between 330 million people. But here we default to the federal government, and then those corporate entities that are, of course, easy targets and the subjects of being pilloried all the time, like big pharma companies. We're pressing to come up with the innovations for antiviral treatments and vaccines.
So, I mean, the federal government should focus on the things the federal government does well. And so a good example of that is, what do you do about borders? What do you do about travelers coming from overseas? They've actually done really good about that stuff, quarantining people coming from overseas. What goes on in state and local communities largely should be the purview of state and public health officials. And then if they need backstop from state and the federal government, then you provide that. It's a good system. It serves us well. And I just, people that essentially have this compulsion that they want everything centralized. They just use incidents like this to kind of push the argument. It's the old Rahm Emanuel never let a crisis go to waste argument.
What about the some this is proposals that have been bandied about going back to all the previous viruses over the last 2 decades, but things like decentralizing supplies of antivirals for more timely distribution, incentivizing through prizes effective vaccines, relax liability laws for vaccine makers, use mass transit for distribution of supplies that are scarce when there's a run on whatever, clean wipes to toilet paper to food. What about some of those proposals? Do they have any?
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason why a lot of those things were never adapted. And that's because once people got through the crisis and they said, okay, let's look at these ideas, they said, well, gee, they're not very efficacious. People that come up with crazy ideas in the middle of a crisis, usually there's a reason for that. They're just crazy ideas.
Yeah, and do you think the Trump administration is on the same page? Are they sending mixed messages?
Well, people can look for mixed messages because that's the nature of the partisan gotcha game that we have. And also people do that in crisis. They want to find inconsistencies so they can have things to complain about. And I think that's largely what we see here. I think the administration response has been largely professional, largely in line what we should expect, and largely effective. I mean, I think you could argue that they should have gotten testing out faster. But they also needed higher, I think, efficacy and confidence in their testing because a lot of the early testing stuff wasn't actually very effective. So it wouldn't have been terribly helpful. But testing a bunch of people with tests that you aren't 100% sure are accurate doesn't get you very far.
All right, Lieutenant Colonel Jim Carafano, Vice President of the Catherine Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for International Studies at the Heritage Foundation. We'll let you get back to power sawing those renovations at Heritage. Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, sounds like the bass. Peyton plays the bass. So like,
nobody, Carafano, West Point grad, he knows how to operate a bandsaw.
He does, and he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Stop the hammering.
Connect with Dan and Amy on the AM 560 The Answer mobile app. Just text the word app to 64636 to download the app today.
The following is a paid political announcement.
Hello, I'm Dr. Willie Wilson, and it's time for reparations. Reparations for the black community are bigger than a single check. Reparations